So okay, we take a bunch of things from functional languages. Do you see it beneficial to bring other concepts like higher-kinded polymorphism, pattern matching, etc.? The answer is probably not. This is a language for people who write systems level and embedded applications. And the philosophy is that generally you're close to what the machine is doing. Even when you have very high level, powerful constructs like polymorphism or, just being able to use types as values. When you do that in this language, you know what the CPU is doing, right? Whereas once you get off into this other stuff, you don't know what the CPU is doing. And so we're definitely, I am not the biggest fan of C++, especially these days, but the reason I still use it and the reason my entire industry still uses it is because certain things are true about it. And that's one of them. And I don't want to break what isn't broken, right? Don't want to fix what isn't broken. Hold on, I got to crunch this cough drop. Do the bake directives generate new functions or just parameterize the baked constants arguments under the hood? If the former, does this work? Procedure of call, bake arguments f of x, y, and z. Okay. Yes, they generate new procedures, completely different, completely precompiled procedures that don't call out to the old procedures. That is how that works. The thing that you said about procedure of call, bake arguments f, x, y, z is not really syntactically correct either time. Like, I'm not sure what you're trying to... The thing that you're doing... I think you have to think more about what you're doing because it's not clear to me. Like, procedure of call requires a call and bake arguments requires a call. And so you would need two calls in your syntax, but you only have one. So maybe think about that and re-ask, because I don't know. Any possible optimizations to be gained from being hyper-specific with polymorphs? Well, for sure, one of the things that we plan to do a lot is bake procedures. Like, say there's a Boolean argument that controls a bunch of if statements in a procedure. You can bake those if statements out, especially if they're static ifs, right? You could write a procedure, well, and in fact, you can put the $sign in front of the name, which, as we've demoed before, is auto bake, right? And then you can call that and it'll auto bake a version with true or a version with false. And of course, that's combinatoric up to however many parameters you want, right? So it's a way to get around this thing that you do in C or C++ of like copy and pasting different versions of a procedure or if-defing things out and recompiling several versions. You don't need to do that here. It's a much cleaner and higher level way of accomplishing the same task. So yeah, we've already done a little bit of that in the game and we plan to do a bunch more. Can you easily set different optimization levels, warning levels, etc. for code files in a build? We don't do it for separately different files right now. That might be something that we could do later. Right now, you can set all those things for the entire build or not. But here's the thing. So you asked about warning levels. Warnings, in the compiler, there are not very many warnings because I do not like the warning culture of C and C++. I think it's pretty terrible the way that's worked out. There are warnings that you saw today because of the use of that type directive, but those are temporary just for the use of our team, right? In like a week or two, once we've scrubbed all the old type directives out of the code, those warnings will go away. So there's really not very many warnings in the system. And The reason for that is because the plan is that you as the application programmer have the best idea of what kind of thing you want to be warned about. And it could be quite a sophisticated thing that you need to write a little mini program to detect. It may not be something that the compiler knows how to look for. And so the idea is that your metaprogram has a bunch of house rules and that you can generate whatever warnings you want from that. And those can be as controllable as you need. And those can be controllable not only on a per file basis, but on a per procedure or per line basis. And we have demoed that in previous demos, and those are available on YouTube. Will print procedure be able to print the signature instead of the address? Yeah, it will. We just don't do that right now, mainly for terseness. Like there's this whole question of like, if you print a struct that has pointers to substructs and all sorts of things, like how deep do you want print to recurse in giving you all that information? I don't exactly know. I feel like we may end up passing an argument to print that controls that. We didn't do that originally because we didn't originally be able to pass arguments after varargs, but now you can. So you can have a varargs procedure that also takes a control argument after the varargs. Therefore, the control argument is optional. And we could probably say like verbose or something. And if it's verbose, it would give you the type of the procedure. Or, you know, maybe it's a whole word of like control bits or something. You know, comments welcome. Actually, let me put up email longer questions, comments to language. Oop, not Calm. Okay, that should go up a little bit. So this is maybe not the best font to draw this in, but you know, this address here, let me switch to this. This address here is not a mailing list. It is just a thing that I read, doesn't go to anyone else. I don't promise to reply to most things because I can't. We're busy working on the language, but we do read everything. So if you have comments that you don't feel are appropriate for Twitch chat, you can send them to this address. Do I have a different font loaded? These are all ugly fonts. Let's try Sans. Ugh. All right, we're going to stick with this. Okay, more questions. What does the tilde do? I saw it up with the polymorphic stuff. That is a relative pointer designator. If you go on YouTube, there is a channel of compiler demos. Let me pull it up. There is a playlist. This demo and Q&A will end up there later tonight or tomorrow. God, they keep changing the stupid interface. So we have a playlist called A Programming Language for Games. We're probably going to have to rename it because it's not really just for games at this point. The original things on this playlist are old. I don't really recommend watching the first couple because they don't have that much relation to what's in the language now. But you can see there's all these demos in here of official things. And one of these, here we go, is the relative pointer demo. And this one starts using the tildes like you see up here and so forth. Some of the syntax is different, so the $ syntax is much shorter now and stuff. Wow, I look tired during this demo. But yeah, relative pointer demo. In case you have already specified that the argument should be an array of unknown length, I guess the same thing happens when you pass an array to a bare $t. Yes. Yes, the polymorphism system does that minor type simplification. Will that fancy error highlighting extend to custom errors? Yes, so the syntax tree has all that bound information. So yes, you can print out the same bounds that the compiler does. I should have mentioned that, but didn't. If you're going to start releasing documentation, does that mean that the syntax has settled down? No. We will update the documentation as the syntax changes. It's just the syntax probably won't change before the initial closed alpha. And we want to have documentation for that, for those initial users. And so why not make it available a little earlier, too? Can you chain metaprograms, i.e. metaprogram gets built by another metaprogram? Yes. You can do whatever you want there. I think we demoed that at some point. Not related to this demo, but when you import or load, does the imported file get imported into the current scope, or does it get imported into a namespace? This may change a little bit soon, mostly in terms of giving you more flexibility, but right now, what happens is every file gets its own file scope, but then has the ability to export things into global scope if it wants to. So it's still kind of flat right now. One of the next features we're going to do is sort of more structured library support. So libraries will have their own namespace, and we're just going to work out exactly how that happens. But yeah, that'll be the next thing. Would I consider working on some more complex metaprograms to demonstrate, validate use cases? Yes, I would consider that. If you go back to that YouTube playlist and look up the compile time execution workspaces, there's a number of demos that show hours of more complicated metaprograms. It's all there for you. You're not clear on why the two different versions of bake exist when the baking two behaviors could be per argument. Could you explain the reasoning in more detail? The reasoning is that there's actually two different namespaces for those things, right? The names of your arguments are not the same names as the names of your polymorph variables. And that means, in principle, even though it's kind of a bad idea, you could use the same name both times. Although it's hard to understand why you would sensibly do that. So it's just set up that way right now. Maybe it's the case that we just want to simplify the world and only have one version. That might be true. You know, as we continue working with the language, one of my primary motivations all the time is to simplify things. And so that would be a thing. It's a thing that I've thought of before, and it's a thing that we may do. I just don't want to simplify prematurely before we have experience using this feature, right? If our experience tells us, yeah, we never really want them to be separate, let's just combine them, then that's fine. But I would rather be precise about what we're doing in the short term and then see how it goes. I'm going to skip questions about next projects. We're staying on topic for programming language. I haven't seen any use of string templates, and I'm not sure if you have discussed it before. I'm curious to know what your thoughts on string templates are and whether you've considered them, like in C#, Kotlin, Groovy, Python, Ruby, and many other languages. If you have considered it, is it just a thing that doesn't fit with the design patterns of this language? I'm not sure what you mean by string templates, but do you mean something that produces a string that is then compiled by the compiler? Yeah, we have that. We totally have that. Go on YouTube, look at the polymorphism demos, and look for the body text directive, which we have. And then also at compile time, you can use a thing called add build string, where you just synthesize a string and add it, right? We've done both of those tons. You just have to go look at the demos. Wouldn't it help to highlight error or warning on the message? Maybe. It's a minor tweak. We'll see. I just don't like fruit salad. So I'd rather just put the highlight on the thing that you want people's eyes to track to, right? If you see red, you know there's an error. You don't need the string error exactly to tell you that there's an error. So if you see red, it's like, oh, that is the error, right? What's the thing I'm using for the resuming in 1 minute message? That is a slideshow program that I built in this language. It's a pretty simple program, but you know, I use it to do slideshows. This was sort of our test slideshow that isn't really meaningful that we use during development. And I just flipped to the last page and changed the slide on the fly. If bake constants and bake arguments are separate keywords, can you bake argument 0 and type 1 at the same time? Right now, the answer is no. You can do that in 2 subsequent steps. Again, it may be that by experience, we find that we want to do that and we find it a little bit of a headache, in which case that would be another reason to combine both of those into one thing. When doing currying of function arguments, is this like functional languages and you have to do them in the order they appear? No. You can do them in any order you want. Do you have an idea of when you'll be starting the limited alpha release? I don't exactly have a strong idea. My vague idea is by the end of the summer. But we don't know for sure. It's just going to be a matter of when these next couple of features are done, because these 2 other features are very important in terms of how you would write code. But once they're in there, I think we're ready. So 2 more big features, if I'm not forgetting anything. What is the comparison of this language to Rust? No, it doesn't sound just like Rust at all. Rust is focused on safety. This language is not focused on safety, and that changes tons and tons of things. Tons and tons and tons of things. Again, if you go back and you watch some of the demos, we're a completely different language than Rust. Completely. In C and C++, arguments can be evaluated in any order. So like f of a of 1, b of 2, b2 can run before a1. Is that true here as well? You know, we can always change these decisions, but the decision right now is that yes, it's true here as well. You sort of want your arguments to be able to evaluate generally simultaneously, you know, not threaded style simultaneously, but like, you know, you want to be able to mix the instructions among each other for good pipelining and stuff. That's just a thing. So yeah, don't depend on order of procedure argument evaluation. What kind of skill levels will you be catering to on release? Would beginners still be able to follow tutorials to jump in, or would the tutorials be more focused on showing the features? I definitely would like to have tutorials that you can follow, but I don't exactly know how understandable they would be to non-programmers, right? Like if you've never learned to program, I don't know if we're going to be teaching you how to program, right? If you know how to program, but are still at a beginner to intermediate skill level, then maybe it's fine, right? We just have to see. You were basically trying to get the procedure of call to a baked procedure. Yeah, so you could do that. So if you have an expression that is like bake whatever, and then say procedure of call of that with some other thing, yes, you can do that. Most of the time, that wouldn't be that useful because often the baked procedure will be the procedure that you want from procedure of call. But sometimes, like I said, you can bake only some of the polymorphic variables out of the baked procedure, and then procedure of call would give you the rest. I don't exactly know what use case would naturally generate that pattern, but there might be one. Is $x:\bool considered an argument or a constant when baking? Right now it is considered an argument, even though it's a mandatory argument. The reason we do that is because there's a version of that where you say $x:\bool, which means, well, maybe pre-bake this if it's available as a constant at compile time, but if it's not, then don't pre-bake it, right? And in that case, we don't want the handling of that to be much different from the handling where it is mandatory. So we make those the same thing. We'll see over time if that's the right decision or not. Is it possible to declare a procedure pointer along with an overloaded procedure right in the declaration where you definitely know to which overload you'd be referring to? Essentially just assigning the func to both a variable and a pointer in the actual declaration. I'm not sure that I visualize what you're asking. You'd have to give me a more concrete example. I'm not picturing it. Threads are difficult. It'd be nice to wrap code with directives like fork. Any thoughts? Well, what do you mean by fork? Do you mean to do threading for you automatically? We're not really looking at stuff like that right now, but what we are looking at stuff that makes threading a lot less error prone, right? The most basic kind of thing would be an equivalent of thread sanitizer from LLVM, but there's other things as well that'll be helpful with threading. It's going to be a while before we do those, and those probably won't be until after we do the limited alpha release, because I don't want to hold it up for that stuff. But it is in the roadmap. Threaded programming is very important, and I don't think that procedural languages these days do very much to help you with that, and they can easily do a lot more than they do. Are you able to swizzle reuse print arguments? Yes, and you can do it exactly like you're saying with the %2, %1, %3. In fact, we had that during today's demo. If I go back to this and say %3, so here I'm just passing red, green, normal as 1, 2, 3, and I'm using 1, 3, so that's red normal, and then 2, 3, so I'm using 3 twice, so that's green normal, right? And then 4 is the first thing, and then 5 is the second thing. So yes, you can do that. And that is good for cases like this, but it's also good for internationalization where you may want to reorder the arguments and so forth, have fun doing that in C++ without building a whole separate system. You'd like to add whether you could declare a pointer to function type directly in the overloaded decal. You mean as one of the parameters? Yes, you could do that. Yeah, but you can do that in C or C++ as well. Like, that's not anything crazy. Do I have any thoughts on language evolution after the release? Sounds like the compiler won't be open sourced. How do you see the process of building the community around it? Well, we're going to kind of wing it. I don't know about long-term evolution. I've said we're not going to open source it initially, but that's only initially, right? After some period of time, we will open source it. It's just that the style of development that I want to do once we initially have an initial body of users is not much different from the style of development we're doing today. I don't want to transition very early to some kind of like cat herding, open source, patch rejecting, tons of email spam every day situation. I don't think that is conducive to rapid work or delicate design decisions, right? And so my goal is to make the best language design that I can. And part of that involves observing what happens when the current design meets reality initially and then tuning based on that. So that is still going to be done in a design chef kind of way. In the farther future, we will open source it, yeah. What's the plans for debugger? Well, you can debug today on Visual Studio or in LLDB or GDB. Long term, I would like to make our own debugger, or at least some kind of program visualizer understander tool, but we haven't done it yet. And we've got a lot of things to do in the short term, so we won't do that anytime soon. Thoughts on a read-eval print loop? I do not think read-eval print loops are very useful. I don't know why functional language people like them. I thought they were cool when I was a freshman in college, but even by the end of college, I was like, yeah, this is kind of stinky. I don't understand why people like them, frankly. And the reason is because you can only do toy things in a read-eval print loop. Like, it's just not real programming. Idea, write the documentation as a metaprogram that executes the code examples it contains. Yeah, maybe. I mean, I just don't want to be absorbed so much in that conceit that we put people's attention where it's not needed. Have we thought about Godbolt-like capabilities like, hey, show me what you generated for this procedure? In the long term, I want to do that. In the short term, it's just sort of out of scope, right? We want to get a good working language first. But yes, ideally, well, I'll just say to date, one of the strong feature sets of this language has been the ability to introspect on your own program to a greater degree than you get with other languages, and with more ease than you get with other languages. So something like that, something like show me the assembly that was generated for this procedure would be a natural extension of that, yes. Other than the array length elision, is there any other example of type simplification that polymorphism does? There might be. I'm not thinking of one off the top of my head, but there is another type simplification, which is if you're using relative pointers and type inference, then we ditch the relative pointer qualifier. So for example, if I've got a struct and I've got some relative string, string tilde s16, right? And I've got some s, right? And now I don't know where that came from. A procedure returned it to me. And now I'm going to say name is s.name, right? So this is a problem because this is stored somewhere very close in memory to this because it has to be reachable in 16 bits, right? But that may be very, very far from the stack. So if I just copy a 16-bit relative pointer string, I'm going to very likely overflow my pointer. So in this case, when you don't declare a type here, this becomes string, right? It's not string tilde s16. And that's just to make relative pointers usable. If in a very, if you want to get very pedantic about making absolutely sure that you have the exact same type for some reason, you can do this, right? And because you're not using the automatic type inference, you get exactly the same type, right? What CI service are we using? We're using the frickin' Microsoft thing that we don't like very much. Someday we should rewrite that. What's it called? I don't know. Oh, that kind of string template. No, we don't do that. You can do that with metaprogramming, but we don't do that. It's also called, you mean string interpolation? No, because lots of reasons. It's bad for internationalization is the main reason. Tim Sweeney was trying to convince me that it wasn't bad for internationalization, but maybe I have to talk to him about it again because no reasons stuck in my mind, which means maybe he didn't convince me. You're colorblind. Thank you for the no color option. Yeah, well, we'll also add color control. So you could pick colors that are not a problem for you personally. Oh, no, different people are meaning different things by string templates. So Ninja Pretzel is talking about string interpolation, which we don't do. Alex Couch is talking about string templates where, oh, maybe it is string interpolation, just more complicatedly. Yeah. No, we don't do that. I don't like it, basically. If someone wants to email to this address and explain to me why string interpolation is good and why it's not bad for internationalization and why it's not bad for, program understandability, then let me know. I think it's pretty bad, though. What are the two more big features that are required for the alpha release? One, I have already mentioned this Q&A, is more formal library support. Two is a macro system that will not work like the C preprocessor. It'll be more like Lisp macros, but not in the style of Lisp. It'll be in the style of the metaprogramming that people have already seen from this language. And then that will have consequences in terms of how other features are implemented. How do I keep myself from burning out while juggling these projects? Well, first of all, I find that when I work hard and get a lot done, it actually makes me more motivated, right? The thing that depresses me and makes me less motivated is when I feel like, just there's so many problems and this goes forever without progress and whatnot, right? So first of all, actually cranking hard makes me motivated, and then take a break, right? Secondly is just by this point, I have a lot of experience doing large projects that are very complicated, and I just know how it goes at this point. And my brain understands it and doesn't freak out as much. Probably if you go skydiving several times, your brain starts to freak out less, although I'm not a skydiver, so I don't know. Thirdly, methods of psychology management are very useful. For example, meditation, but not necessarily only meditation. Andrew Russell is saying not having specified order of evaluation for arguments is not a good plan. I disagree. That has literally never been a problem for me in C++. Literally 0 times in my entire programming career. If you want to email to this address and tell me why it's a problem, maybe we'll have a discussion about it. But literally, I have been programming in C and C++ since 1991. So 27 years. I have had that problem 0 times in 27 years. So if you're going to convince me that it's not a good plan, you're going to have to explain why. Can we get some exposure to the basics of the game engine? Well, there's been a bunch of streams. So when I showed that playlist of demos, there's also a playlist called Game Engine Programming. Let me show that. Right. My channel. Creator Studio might get me there faster. Video. Where's the playlist? Why does YouTube keep moving the playlists link? Frickin', there it is. Okay, so one of the playlists is Game Engine Programming. There are 40 videos in here, and I go through different topics where I implement different things. Animation, drop-down console, controlling the animation with like an animation graph usable by an artist, right? Metaprogram, whoever was asking about metaprogram functionality, checking print calls is part of that. Editor, in-game editing UI, the testing system. So you can see many things about how the engine works there. Just go to youtube.com/playlist/?list equals blah, 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 or search for it. Probably better. Do string literals act like in C or C++, where you concatenate two strings at compile time by literally putting two literals adjacent to one another? No, we do not do that. If you want to do that, though, you can use a run directive and concatenate them. And because you're using a run directive and invoking compile time operations, you can do whatever you want. You can rot13 a string at compile time and glue it onto its non-rot13 counterpart with arbitrary joiners in the middle, and then you can uppercase it. Nobody cares. You can do whatever you want. It's way more powerful. Rather than add templates as another feature of the compiler, wouldn't it make more sense to make metaprogramming easier and quicker to use, or at least have an easier subset to accomplish something like this? It seems that as you add more and more features, the language becomes cluttered, not as elegant. The language is still pretty elegant. Like, it's just that you're not familiar with it, right? If you were familiar with it, it wouldn't seem very complicated. It's tremendously simpler than C++, crazily simpler than C++, and yet it's also more powerful than C++, so there's that. But I understand, if you're just sitting on the outside and just seeing these things once in a while, it may seem complicated. Adding more metaprogramming features is all well and good, but the thing about metaprogramming is it's harder to debug than straight up programming. So metaprogramming is powerful, but I don't think you want to do everything by metaprogramming. Maybe I'm wrong about that. And one possible future for the language is that we do the initial releases and then we find out more and more ways to implement things that were built into the compiler as user-level libraries instead that use metaprogramming. And I would be fine with that. I like simplifying things. But I don't want to assume that that's going to be the way it is, right? There's other reasons to do that. So for example, when features are built into the compiler actually knows what's going on and can give you much better error messages. Whereas if just a metaprogram's doing something and it's generating some desugared output that then the compiler compiles and then that's wrong, the error messages are often going to be really crappy. And the difference between those two things can be an hour a day of programming time, right? And that's a tremendous friction. So I'm making these decisions carefully, which is not to say that they're not right, or not to say that they're not wrong. I mean, it's not to say that they are all right, but they're the best decisions that I have. Again, if you have a counterpoint, you can email it here. Can you bake varargs? I believe so. If not, we'll make it work. Enemy Mouse is back explaining his thing. I'm imagining you are declaring an overloaded procedure, and in the course of doing so, you also generate a pointer to that procedure and a type of said procedure all in one shot at the original procedure declaration site. I see. Maybe there's a way of that happening, but I don't know of it, no. What kind of things can you put notes on? I've seen functions and maybe structs. You can put a note on any declaration right now. And then the way notes get onto procedures is they actually flow from the declaration onto the procedure. But they're technically on the declaration, which is a different thing. Is there any facility for Doxygen style documentation generated from the code and comments automatically? Dude, I hate that stuff so hard. I never understood that. It always seemed like the most useless thing in the world to me. If you find it useful, great, but like, ugh, right? That said, there will be something that gives you a summary of what the procedures are that you can call in a library or in the main program. And there will be something that gives you descriptions of those if the programmer provides that, right? I don't think of it so much as a Doxygen style thing as much as, like, if you know how Lisp or Emacs work, where, you know, in the declaration, you can provide a short string that tells people a little bit about how to use it. That's fine. But most auto-generated documentation is terrible. Like, I don't understand. Not only is it not useful, it's just soul-killing to look at. Part of me died when I first saw that and people were trying to tell me how great it was. I was like, what? What? But maybe it's just part of my brain that doesn't work like other people's brain. I don't know. When you do the work on parallelism, would you consider an SPMD model, like is used in languages such as OpenMPI or OpenCL? Maybe eventually, but that's not my concern initially. My concern initially is to make very basic working man's parallelism much easier to do. So just stuff like, man, I've got a mutex and I want to make sure that I only access this variable from inside the mutex. Or like, you know, here's an integer on a struct and I want access to it to be atomic, right? That kind of a thing. All this more frou-frou stuff we can deal with later, but that kind of stuff, given the aforementioned help, it's much easier to write your own job system or whatever that'll kick off the same procedure 20 times in different threads or whatever. Yeah, so the as colon equals assignment in this language doesn't work like in C++. You're only allowed to have one on a line. It's not an expression. So yeah, you can't do that, and that's by design. Do I know which versions of Windows the binaries we produce would run on? We're trying to minimize dependencies. We still depend on libc right now, so it would depend on like what dependencies that libc has. But the goal is to eventually be off of that, right? On Linux, we still have to depend on libc because as far as I know, you can't not do that. Maybe I'm wrong about that. But on Windows, you certainly can build an executable that only requires kernel 32, for example. So it's pretty important to people who make games to support versions of Windows as far back as possible. And we're always in some kind of passive-aggressive fight with Microsoft about that, because Microsoft seems to always want to like sneak dependencies into the latest crap in the newest version of Visual Studio. I don't understand why they're not more careful about that. How is SIMD done under the hood? We don't do SIMD yet. It's just not in the design yet. We'll think about it later. Going to be curious to see how the macro facility ends up being different from your existing metaprogramming to warrant doing both. I think it will make sense when you see it. But as always, if experience leads us to understand that one of them is unnecessary, then we'll take it out. Dude, I have no problem spending months of work on something and then taking it out later. Like, in my opinion, that's part of how you make things good. So that's just how it is. You're making a game in C that you want to translate down the road. Do you have any suggestions on how to develop now that'll make that smoother? Not really. I mean, if you're in C, there's not going to be much that you can do that you won't be able to do here. I mean, maybe if you're doing really weird stuff involving lots of nested macros, because we don't do a text preprocessor, that probably wouldn't port over directly. But if you want a text preprocessor, you can insert one in the compile pipeline and it'll work fine. So even that's not a showstopper. Does this language favor immutability by default? No, not now. Although we're thinking about whether something like that is helpful. At some point, if ideas like that are not that proven, then we might as well just do version 1 of the language without them and see if they make sense in version 2. Doxygen might be a bad example. RustDoc is really the example I like. Yeah, I've never seen RustDoc, so I don't know how that is different from Doxygen or how that makes it better. Were there any big announcements? No. We did not announce that we are releasing a Roadster that drives out of the back of a truck. What do you think of the idea of assembly of that would return the bytecode of a given procedure? I think that would be cool, as mentioned earlier. Is SOA to AOS still in the language? Eventually it will come back. Yes, it is not in right now. You think I said the current engine is GL-based, given my comments about Apple's deprecation of GL? Are we stuck behind a Vulkan port? No, what you will be stuck behind is an engine that has different backends for different platforms, probably. And I don't know if one of those will be Vulkan. Maybe. We'll see. But that'll actually be more educational because it'll be closer to how real game developers release games anyway. You don't need libc for Linux. You can issue the syscalls yourself. Okay, so maybe we can get out from that dependency as well. Oh, they're architecture dependent. Maybe that's not so appealing. If they're architecture dependent, I don't know. I don't know, man. We'll see. How do we handle copy versus move semantics? There is no such thing as copy versus move semantics. There is just copy semantics, just like in C. I think that whole thing in C++ is part of a giant, giant, giant disaster. I don't know if we will eventually add move. I don't think so. If we do, it'll only be if I'm convinced it won't be a disaster. We certainly will not add references if I can help it. Famous last words. Who knows? Who knows what's going to happen, but yeah. Have you seen the Mike Acton Unity talk where you can tag the data streams? I didn't see that part of it. That seems like a cool idea. Google has a single include file thing that calls Linux syscalls on a few different architectures. That's good to know. Okay, thanks everybody for coming by and staying all the way through the Q&A. I'm going to go out and get a well-deserved chocolate bar now for my last-minute programming that finished the features for the demo. Who knows? We might live stream later tonight because I want to do some compiler cleanup. Thank you for coming by. What do you think about giving a stack trace when you crash? We already do that. And like I said, I'm hoping the next demo will be a bigger feature. We'll see if that's true. If enough time goes by without the bigger feature being done, I might do another one like today where we just recap the smaller stuff. We will see.